The knife pressed against Alyssa's throat was cold, but not as cold as the voice behind it. "You're going to call him," Caleb whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "Tell your boyfriend exactly where you are." Alyssa's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the phone in her trembling hand. 3 weeks ago, she'd been nothing more than a woman eating dinner alone. Now she was bait in a game she didn't understand, caught between men who spoke in violence and shadows. "He's not my boyfriend," she managed, her voice barely steady. Caleb's laugh was sharp. "Right. That's why Seojun dismantled my entire operation for you." The warehouse around them felt endless in the darkness, filled with the kind of silence that promised terrible things. Alyssa thought of the restaurant where this had all started, the warm lights, the gentle way Seojun had pulled out that chair, the dignity he'd given her when she'd needed it most. She'd never imagined kindness could be so dangerous. Welcome to Korean Mafia lovers. Before we dive into Alyssa and Seojun's intense story, comment where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything and helps us bring you more captivating stories like this one. Alyssa checked her phone for the 5th time in 10 minutes. No new messages, no apology, no explanation. Just the glow of unread silence reflecting back at her from the screen. The restaurant was elegant in a way that made loneliness louder. Low golden lights, couples leaning toward each other. Quiet laughter carried over crystal glasses. Alyssa sat alone at a table meant for two, hands folded carefully in her lap, posture straight, like she wasn't slowly shrinking inside. Her date's name, Marco, still hovered in her thoughts like an unfinished sentence. He had insisted on this place, Lumiere, with its French cuisine and prices that made her wince, said it would be worth it, then disappeared into the digital void like he'd never existed at all. The waiter approached for the 3rd time, his smile professional but tinged with pity. "Miss, would you like to order an appetizer while you wait?" Alyssa's cheeks burned. Around her, conversations continued in hushed tones, but she felt the weight of curious glances, the subtle head turns of other diners who'd noticed her solitary vigil. "I'm still waiting," she said softly, though the words tasted like ash. She wasn't. Not really. Marco had made his choice clear through silence. Across the room, Seojun noticed her before he noticed the problem. He hadn't come to Lumiere for pleasure. Pleasure was a luxury he'd abandoned years ago, along with trust and the naive belief that people meant what they said. The private room upstairs was hosting a discreet meeting, the kind that required careful observation, controlled timing, and an exit strategy planned 3 moves ahead. But the woman at table 12 didn't belong to any strategy. She belonged to a moment Seojun recognized with uncomfortable clarity, the particular humiliation of being abandoned in public, forced to maintain dignity while your world crumbled in real time. Seojun had built his reputation on reading people, on understanding their weaknesses and leveraging them when necessary. The skill had kept him alive through gang wars and business negotiations that could turn deadly with a misplaced word. This woman's weakness wasn't greed or ambition or fear. It was hope. She was still hoping her date would walk through those doors, still believing in explanations that would never come. The realization hit him with unexpected force. She reminded him of someone he used to be, before the world taught him that hope was just another word for vulnerability. Without conscious decision, Seojun stood from his corner table, abandoning his surveillance position. His security detail, Yuri and Jin, exchanged glances, but didn't move to follow. They knew better than to question their boss's instincts, even when those instincts led him toward a stranger's pain. He crossed the restaurant with the quiet confidence that had made him feared in boardrooms and back alleys alike. Conversations paused as he passed, not from recognition, but from the unmistakable presence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. At table 12 he stopped. Alyssa looked up, startled by the shadow that had fallen across her table. The man standing there was younger than she'd expected from his commanding presence, maybe early 30s, with sharp features that belonged in magazines and a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "I hope you don't mind," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place, "but your date is late, and mine isn't coming at all." Before she could respond, he was already pulling out the chair across from her, settling into it with the fluid grace of someone who'd never been told no. You. What? Alyssa blinked, her mind struggling to process this unexpected development. Around them, the restaurant's energy shifted. The pitying glances transformed into something else. Curiosity, perhaps even envy. The staff relaxed, their concern for the abandoned woman evaporating now that the picture had corrected itself. "I'm Seojun," he said simply, folding his hands on the white tablecloth. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but you also don't have to sit here alone." Something in his tone, steady, undemanding, made Alyssa's shoulders drop from their defensive hunch. "I'm Alyssa," she replied quietly. "And thank you." The waiter appeared instantly, as if Seojun's presence had summoned him from thin air. "Sir, would you like to see the wine menu?" "Whatever the lady prefers," Seojun said without taking his eyes off Alyssa. "And we'll need a few minutes with the dinner menu." As the waiter retreated, Alyssa found herself studying this stranger who'd rescued her from public humiliation. His dark hair was styled with careful precision, and there was something about his stillness that suggested coiled energy, like a predator at rest. "You really don't have to do this," she said. "I was just about to leave anyway." "Were you?" His slight smile held no judgment. "Because from where I was sitting, it looked like you were hoping he'd still show up." The accuracy of his observation made her chest tighten. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been there." They didn't flirt. They didn't perform the elaborate dance of first-date conversation. Instead, they talked about safe things, favorite comfort foods, places they liked to walk when the city felt too loud, the particular awkwardness of modern dating. Seojun listened more than he spoke, asking questions that drew out her thoughts without prying into her pain. Alyssa found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation, charmed by his unexpected gentleness. When the restaurant manager approached their table with barely concealed anxiety, Seojun's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly. The warmth remained, but underneath it, Alyssa glimpsed something harder. "Mr. Kim," the manager said carefully, "I hope everything is satisfactory." "Perfect, Evan." "Thank you." Seojun's tone was pleasant but final. The manager retreated quickly, and Alyssa caught the exchange of meaningful looks between Seojun and two men seated near the bar. The pieces didn't quite fit together, but she sensed undercurrents she couldn't understand. "Do you come here often?" she asked lightly. "Occasionally, for business." His answer was truthful but incomplete, and they both knew it. When dinner ended, Seojun walked her to the valet stand, but didn't ask for her number, didn't suggest a second meeting, didn't make promises about calling. "Thank you," Alyssa said again, meaning it more than she'd meant anything in weeks. "For tonight. For making me feel human," he suggested gently. "Visible." Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "You were always visible, Alyssa. Some people just don't know how to look." He waited until her car arrived, helped her into the driver's seat with old-fashioned courtesy, then stepped back into the night like he'd never been there at all. Alyssa drove home with the strange sensation that her life had just shifted in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. What she didn't know was that Caleb Morrison, seated at the bar throughout their dinner, had drawn his own conclusions about what he'd witnessed. In his world, women were currency, and protection meant possession. He'd just identified Seojun Kim's newest weakness. And weaknesses, in Caleb's experience, were meant to be exploited. 3 days passed before Alyssa noticed she was being followed. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, the lingering unease that came from being stood up in public, from having her trust shattered by someone she'd barely known. But the feeling persisted, eyes on her back during her morning coffee run, the same dark sedan in her rearview mirror on 2 separate occasions, a man in a baseball cap who seemed to appear wherever she went. "You're being dramatic," she told herself, but her hand shook as she unlocked her apartment door. Nina, her best friend since college, arrived for their weekly dinner with wine and immediate concern. "You look terrible," she announced, settling onto Alyssa's couch with characteristic bluntness. "And I mean that with love." "Thanks," Alyssa said dryly, but she was grateful for Nina's presence. The apartment had felt too quiet lately, too full of shadows that might or might not be imagined. "Seriously, what's wrong? You've been weird since that disaster date. Alyssa curled up in the opposite corner of the couch, pulling a throw pillow into her lap. It wasn't a disaster. It was complicated. She told Nina about Seojun, the mysterious stranger who'd saved her from humiliation. The dinner that had felt more real than any date she'd been on in months. The way he'd disappeared without asking for anything in return. And you haven't heard from him since? Nina's eyebrows rose. Honey, that's not romantic, that's suspicious. It's not suspicious, it's... Alyssa searched for the right word. Respectful. He didn't want anything from me. Everyone wants something. The cynicism in Nina's voice made Alyssa wince, partly because she'd thought the same thing, and partly because she desperately wanted to believe otherwise. Meanwhile, across the city, Seojun was discovering exactly how much trouble one act of kindness could create. The security briefing took place in his office on the 32nd floor of Kim Industries, a legitimate construction company that served as the public face of his less legitimate enterprises. Yuri spread photographs across the glass conference table with the efficiency of someone who'd delivered bad news many times before. Caleb Morrison, Yuri said without preamble, mid-level dealer trying to move up the food chain. He's been asking questions about you for the past week. Seojun studied the surveillance photos, a thin man with nervous eyes and expensive clothes that didn't quite fit his frame. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he thinks he's found leverage. Yuri's expression was grim. He was at Lumiere 3 nights ago, same night you had dinner with the woman. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Seojun's voice, when he spoke, was deadly quiet. He saw Alyssa. More than saw, he's had her followed since then. Amateur surveillance, but persistent. Jin, Seojun's other lieutenant, leaned forward. We could end this quickly. Morrison's operation is small, vulnerable. One night, and he disappears. No. The word cracked like a whip. Seojun stood, moving to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Somewhere down there, Alyssa was going about her normal life, unaware that his moment of compassion had painted a target on her back. Sir? Yuri's confusion was evident. Violence draws attention. Attention draws investigation. Investigation puts her in more danger, not less. Seojun turned back to his men, his decision crystallizing. We handle this quietly. How quietly? Morrison wants to move up? Let's help him right off the board. The plan Seojun outlined was elegant in its simplicity. No bullets, no blood, no bodies that would require explanation. Instead, they would dismantle Caleb's operation piece by piece, cutting supply lines, freezing accounts, exposing informants to their handlers. Within a week, Caleb Morrison would find himself with no product, no money, and no allies. And the woman? Jin asked. Seojun's jaw tightened. She stays protected. From a distance. What he didn't say, what he couldn't admit even to himself, was that Alyssa had become more than a complication. In 3 hours of conversation, she'd reminded him of something he'd thought he'd lost forever, the possibility of genuine connection, unmarked by fear or calculation. He'd built his empire by understanding that everything had a price, that loyalty could be bought, and trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But Alyssa had asked for nothing, expected nothing, and somehow given him more than anyone who demanded everything. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to protect her from his world, he'd already dragged her into it. Back in her apartment, Alyssa was beginning to understand that her paranoia might not be paranoia at all. The man in the baseball cap had been outside her office building that morning. The same man. She was sure of it now. Though she couldn't explain how she knew, something about the way he held his shoulders, the deliberate casualness of his posture. I'm staying here tonight, Nina announced, reading Alyssa's expression. And tomorrow we're going to the police. And tell them what? That I think someone might be watching me. They'll think I'm crazy. Better crazy than dead. The bluntness of the statement hung between them like a physical presence. Alyssa pulled the throw pillow tighter against her chest, trying to ward off the chill that had nothing to do with the apartment's temperature. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You're safe. Trust me. Both women stared at the screen. "Who the hell is that?" Nina demanded. Alyssa's throat felt dry. I think it might be him." "Seojun. The mysterious dinner guy? How did he get your number?" It was a good question, one that should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, Alyssa felt an unexpected sense of relief, as if someone had just turned on a light in a dark room. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I believe him." Nina looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. But as Alyssa stared at those 3 words on her phone screen, she realized that sometimes belief was all you had to hold on to. Outside her building, the man in the baseball cap received a phone call that would change everything. "It's done." Caleb's voice was tight with frustration. "But this is taking too long. I want to move on her tomorrow night." "Sir, maybe we should reconsider." "Tomorrow night," Caleb repeated. "Kim thinks he's untouchable. Let's see how untouchable he feels when his girlfriend is asking him to choose between her life and his territory." The line went dead, leaving the surveillance operative staring up at Alyssa's lit windows with growing unease. He'd signed up to watch and report, not to participate in kidnapping. But orders were orders, and Caleb Morrison wasn't known for accepting failure. In her apartment, Alyssa fell asleep holding her phone, Nina curled up on the couch beside her. Neither of them noticed the dark sedan that had been parked across the street for 3 hours, or the way its occupant seemed to be counting the floors to Alyssa's window. The game was accelerating, and Alyssa was about to discover that some forms of protection came with a price she'd never imagined paying. The flowers arrived at Alyssa's office the next morning, with no card, no explanation, just 24 white roses that made her secretary raise questioning eyebrows. "Secret admirer?" Janet asked, arranging them in a vase with obvious curiosity. Alyssa touched one of the petals, soft as silk between her fingers. White roses meant new beginnings, fresh starts, or so her grandmother had always said. Something like that. Her phone buzzed. "The flowers are beautiful, but you're more beautiful when you smile." This time, the unknown number didn't frighten her. Instead, warmth spread through her chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. She found herself looking toward the office windows, wondering if he was somewhere out there, watching over her in ways she couldn't see. "How do you know I'm not smiling?" she texted back. "Because you haven't smiled properly since Tuesday night." The accuracy of his observation made her breath catch. She hadn't realized how carefully he'd been watching, how thoroughly he'd memorized her expressions during their dinner. The thought should have been unsettling, but instead it felt like being seen, truly seen, for the first time in months. "Are you always this observant?" "Only when it matters." Across the city, Seojun set down his phone and returned his attention to the reports scattered across his desk. Caleb Morrison's operation was crumbling faster than anticipated. 2 of his suppliers had mysteriously lost their shipments to customs raids. His money launderer had been arrested on unrelated charges. His best muscle had been offered better positions elsewhere. "He's getting desperate," Yuri reported, sliding a new photograph across the desk. This was taken an hour ago outside her building. The image showed Caleb himself, no longer content to rely on surveillance from a distance. His presence meant the timeline had accelerated, that whatever he was planning would happen soon. "Double the protection detail," Seojun ordered, "and I want to know the moment he moves. Sir, with respect, wouldn't it be easier to just tell her the truth? Warn her directly." Seojun's hand tightened on his coffee cup. "And say what? That having dinner with me put her life in danger? That my world destroys everything it touches?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Seojun had spent years building walls between his business and his personal life, keeping the violence and moral compromises contained. But Alyssa had slipped through those walls without trying, and now she was trapped in the crossfire of a war she didn't even know existed. His phone rang, the secure line reserved for emergencies. "Boss," Jin's voice was tight with urgency. "Morrison's moving, tonight. We intercepted communications about a pickup at her apartment building." Seojun was already reaching for his jacket. "How many men?" 3 plus Morrison himself. They're planning to take her to the warehouse district. The warehouse district, where screams echoed off concrete walls and bodies disappeared into the river. Seojun's blood turned to ice. "Mobilize everyone," he ordered. I want them intercepted before they reach her building. And if we're too late, the question hung between them like a blade. Seojun checked his weapon, muscle memory guiding his hands through the familiar motions. Then we go to war. At her apartment, Alyssa was finally beginning to relax. Nina had agreed to stay another night, and they'd spent the evening cooking dinner together, laughing at old college stories, pretending that everything was normal. "I think you're right," Nina said, curling up on the couch with a glass of wine. "Maybe I was being paranoid about the whole stalking thing. You haven't noticed anything weird today, right?" Alyssa shook her head, though she couldn't quite shake the feeling of being watched. The flowers had helped. The mysterious texts had helped. But underneath the warmth was a current of unease she couldn't name. "Right. And mystery dinner guy seems sweet, in a brooding, potentially dangerous way." "He's not dangerous," Alyssa protested, though she wasn't entirely sure why she believed that. There had been something in his stillness, in the way restaurant staff had deferred to him, that suggested depths she hadn't explored. "All the interesting ones are dangerous, honey. The question is whether they're dangerous to you or dangerous for you." Before Alyssa could respond, the lights went out. The apartment plunged into darkness, so complete it felt solid, pressing against them like a living thing. Outside, the streetlights had died too, leaving only the distant glow of the city beyond. Power outage. Nina's voice was small in the darkness. Alyssa's phone buzzed with an incoming call from the unknown number. She answered immediately. "Alyssa," Seojun's voice was sharp with urgency. "Listen to me very carefully. You're in danger, real danger. I need you to go to your bedroom, lock the door and hide in the closet. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "What?" "Seojun, what's happening? There are men coming for you. They think you're important to me and they want to use you as leverage. I'm on my way, but you need to hide. Now." The line went dead, just as Alyssa heard the unmistakable sound of her front door being forced open. Nina grabbed her arm, both women frozen in terror as footsteps echoed through the apartment. Heavy boots, multiple sets, moving with the confidence of people who'd done this before. "Bedroom," Alyssa whispered, pulling Nina toward the hallway. They made it 3 steps before the flashlight beam caught them, bright and blinding in the darkness. "There she is," a voice said with satisfaction. "Alyssa Chen, right? You're coming with us." The man behind the flashlight was thin and nervous-looking, but the gun in his other hand was steady. Behind him, 2 larger figures blocked the exit. "There's been a mistake," Alyssa said, her voice surprisingly calm. "I don't know what you want, but we want Seojun Kim to understand that his actions have consequences." The thin man, Caleb, though she didn't know his name yet, interrupted. "And you're going to help us teach him that lesson." Nina stepped forward, brave and foolish. "She doesn't know anyone named Seojun Kim. You've got the wrong person." Caleb's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Lady, I watched them have dinner together, watched him protect her, care for her. Trust me, we've got exactly the right person." The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Seojun hadn't just been kind to her. He'd been protecting her, and somehow that protection had made her a target. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "We want you to make a phone call," Caleb said, gesturing with the gun. "Tell your boyfriend exactly where you are and ask him to come alone. No backup, no weapons, no tricks. Just him, trading his life for yours." Alyssa's chest tightened. "And if I refuse?" Caleb's smile was cold. "Then your friend here learns what happens to people who get in my way." The gun swung toward Nina, who went pale, but didn't step back. In that moment, Alyssa understood that this wasn't about her at all. It was about Seojun, about a world of violence and power that she'd stumbled into without understanding the rules. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll make the call." But even as she reached for her phone, she could hear sirens in the distance growing closer. Seojun had said he was on his way, and somehow she believed he would keep that promise. The question was whether he would arrive in time or whether her kindness to a stranger would cost them both everything. Outside, Seojun's convoy was 3 blocks away and closing fast. But 3 blocks might as well have been 3 miles, when seconds could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. The game had reached its endgame, and Alyssa was about to discover exactly how far a man would go to protect someone he barely knew but couldn't bear to lose. The warehouse smelled like rust and broken dreams. Alyssa sat tied to a metal chair in the center of the vast space, her wrists raw from the rope, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nina was unconscious in a corner, a purple bruise blooming across her temple where one of Caleb's men had struck her for trying to run. "She's awake," one of the guards announced, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Caleb emerged from the shadows like something out of a nightmare, his nervous energy replaced by the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. In his hand was Alyssa's phone, the screen glowing with Seojun's contact information. "Time to make that call," he said, holding the device just out of reach. "And remember, one wrong word, one hint that this isn't voluntary and your friend pays the price." Alyssa's throat felt like sandpaper. "What exactly do you want me to say?" "Simple. Tell him where you are. Tell him you need him to come alone. Tell him." Caleb's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Tell him that you're scared, and you need him to choose between saving you and protecting his territory." The words hit her like physical blows. This wasn't just about kidnapping. It was about forcing Seojun to abandon everything he'd built, everyone who depended on him, for someone he barely knew. "He won't come," she said quietly. "We had dinner once, that's all." "Oh, he'll come." Caleb's certainty was absolute. "You see, I've been watching Seojun Kim for years, waiting for him to show weakness. And you, sweetheart, are his first mistake." He dialed the number and held the phone to her ear. It rang once before Seojun's voice filled the space between them. "Alyssa? Are you hurt?" The relief in his voice, the raw concern, made her chest tighten with emotions she couldn't name. I'm okay for now." "Where are you?" Caleb pressed the gun against Nina's unconscious form, and Alyssa closed her eyes. "The old Morrison warehouse near the docks. Seojun, they want you to come alone, but don't—" The phone was yanked away before she could finish the warning. "You heard her," Caleb said into the device. "1 hour. Come alone. No weapons, no backup. Or she dies, and then I start working through everyone else you care about." The line went dead, leaving only the sound of Alyssa's ragged breathing and the distant rumble of traffic from the highway. Miles away, Seojun stared at his phone with the cold fury of a man who'd just been checkmated by an amateur. "Sir?" Yuri's voice seemed to come from very far away. "He has her." The words tasted like ashes. "Morrison has Alyssa." The war room at Kim Industries erupted into controlled chaos. Maps appeared on screens, surveillance feeds flickered to life, and 24 of the most dangerous men in the city waited for orders that could start a war. "We can have the warehouse surrounded in 20 minutes, Jin reported. "Full tactical team, snipers in position, extraction ready." "No." Seojun's voice cut through the planning like a blade. He said, "Come alone." "Boss, that's suicide. Morrison's not going to let either of you walk out of there alive." Seojun knew that, had known it the moment he'd heard Alyssa's voice, tight with fear, but still trying to warn him. This wasn't about territory or money or respect. This was about destroying him completely, taking away his ability to protect the people who mattered. The terrible irony was that Alyssa shouldn't have mattered. One dinner, a few text messages, flowers sent on impulse. It should have been nothing more than a pleasant memory. But somewhere between her grateful smile and her stubborn refusal to let humiliation break her, she'd become something else. Something worth risking everything for. "I'm going," he said quietly. "Sir, I'm going alone as requested, but that doesn't mean I'm going unprepared." Seojun moved to the wall safe, retrieving items that had been gifts from grateful allies over the years. "Give me 30 minutes, then move your teams into position. If I'm not out in an hour—" "We level the building," Yuri finished grimly. Seojun nodded, checking the small blade concealed in his watch, the ceramic gun that wouldn't trigger metal detectors, the emergency beacon that would signal his team if activated. Morrison thought he was forcing a choice between love and loyalty. He was about to learn that some men refused to choose. Back in the warehouse, Alyssa watched Caleb pace like a caged animal, his nervous energy returning now that the call was made. "You really think he'll come?" one of his men asked. "Oh, he'll come. Men like Kim, they think they're untouchable until you find their weakness. Then they're just like everyone else, predictable." Alyssa tested the ropes around her wrists, feeling for any give in the knots. "You don't know him very well, do you?" Caleb stopped pacing, his attention snapping to her like a rubber band. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I mean, you think this is about me, about him choosing between his business and some woman he barely knows." Alyssa met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "But you're wrong." "Am I? This isn't about love or weakness, or any of the things you think you understand." She thought of Seojun's stillness at dinner, the way he'd listened without judgment, the careful distance he'd maintained even while offering protection. This is about the kind of man he is, and men like that don't abandon people who need them. Caleb's laugh was harsh. "We'll see about that." But something in his expression had shifted, uncertainty creeping in around the edges of his confidence. For the first time, Alyssa wondered if he'd miscalculated, if his understanding of Seojun Kim was as flawed as his understanding of her. 45 minutes later, car headlights swept across the warehouse windows. "He's here," the lookout called from his position by the door. Caleb straightened his jacket, checked his weapon, and smiled with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd won. Showtime. The warehouse door opened with a screech of rusted metal, and Seojun Kim walked into the trap that had been set for him. He moved with the same quiet confidence Alyssa remembered from the restaurant, hands visible and empty, no sign of fear or hesitation. "Let her go," he said simply. Caleb gestured to his men, who raised their weapons in unison. "I don't think you're in a position to make demands." Seojun's gaze found Alyssa across the space, and something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but understanding, recognition of something worth fighting for. "You wanted me here," Seojun said, his voice carrying clearly through the warehouse. "I'm here, now let both women go and we can discuss whatever it is you really want." "What I want," Caleb said, stepping closer, "is to watch you choose, your empire or her life, your territory or her safety. Choose, Kim. Right now." Seojun looked at Alyssa one more time, memorizing her face in case these were the last moments they'd have. Then he smiled, cold, dangerous, and absolutely certain. "I choose both." The beacon in his pocket activated with a silent pulse, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the warehouse, his army began to move. But first he had to survive long enough for them to arrive, and that, Seojun reflected, as Caleb's face twisted with rage, was going to be the interesting part. The first shot shattered the warehouse's silence like breaking glass. Seojun had moved the instant Caleb reached for his weapon, diving behind a concrete pillar as bullets sparked off metal and stone. His own ceramic gun was in his hand before his knees hit the floor, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought would have been too slow. "Kill him!" Caleb screamed, his carefully laid plan dissolving into chaos. Kill them both. But Seojun had spent 15 years learning how to turn chaos into opportunity. The warehouse's layout was burned into his memory from the surveillance photos, every pillar, every exit, every shadow that could provide cover. More importantly, he knew his team was already moving into position, cutting off escape routes and preparing for the kind of surgical strike that had made Kim Industries feared throughout the city. Alyssa pressed herself against the floor as gunfire erupted around her, the metal chair she'd been tied to providing minimal protection from the violence that had exploded through the space. Near the wall, Nina was stirring, consciousness returning at the worst possible moment. "Stay down!" Alyssa shouted, her voice barely audible over the sound of weapons firing. One of Caleb's men moved toward her, weapon raised, and Alyssa closed her eyes. This was how it ended, not with romance or rescue, but with brutal mathematics of violence she'd never wanted to understand. The shot that dropped the gunman came from an impossible angle, fired by someone who shouldn't have been able to see the target. Seojun had somehow circled through the warehouse's maze of machinery, using shadows and cover to position himself between the threat and Alyssa. "You're supposed to be trapped," Caleb's voice cracked with frustration and growing fear. I was never trapped, Seojun replied calmly, his position hidden somewhere in the industrial maze. I was buying time. As if summoned by his words, the warehouse's main lights blazed to life, flooding the space with harsh illumination that eliminated every shadow. Through the windows, Alyssa could see dark figures moving with military precision, surrounding the building like pieces on a chessboard. Caleb spun in circles, his remaining men clustering around him as they realized their advantage had evaporated. This isn't over, Kim. You think you can protect everyone. You think your money and your connections make you untouchable. No, Seojun said, stepping out from behind a shipping container with his weapon trained on Caleb's chest. I think you made a mistake. What mistake? You assumed I'd have to choose between my world and hers. Seojun's voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who'd never learned to lose. You never considered that I might bring her into my world instead. The warehouse doors exploded inward as Yuri and Jin led the tactical team through the breach, their movements coordinated with the precision of a symphony. Within seconds, Caleb's remaining men were on the ground, weapons kicked away, hands secured behind their backs. Caleb himself stood frozen in the center of the space, his grand plan reduced to rubble around his feet. You can't do this, he said desperately. I have rights, I have connections. People will ask questions. What people? Seojun asked mildly. Your suppliers? Already arrested. Your money launderer. Disappeared. Your protection. Bought and paid for by someone else. He gestured to his men, who moved to secure the scene with efficient brutality. You wanted to play in the big leagues, Morrison? Congratulations, you just learned the rules. While his team handled the cleanup, Seojun crossed to where Alyssa sat against the wall, her wrists still bearing rope burns, her eyes wide with shock and adrenaline. Are you hurt? He asked, kneeling beside her with the same gentle concern he'd shown at the restaurant. She looked around the warehouse at the unconscious men, at the weapons, at the evidence of violence that had erupted around her. I don't understand any of this. I know. He helped her to her feet, his touch careful and respectful. And I'm sorry you had to see it. Who are you? The question came out as a whisper. Really? Seojun was quiet for a long moment, weighing truth against protection, honesty against the safety that came with ignorance. I'm someone who builds things, he said finally, and sometimes to build something lasting, you have to tear down what came before. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was honest in the ways that mattered. Alyssa studied his face, seeing past the careful control to the man who'd risked everything to save someone he barely knew. The flowers, she said suddenly. The texts. You were protecting me. I was trying to. I failed. No. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his cheek, where a cut from flying debris had drawn blood. You came for me, even when it was dangerous, even when it was stupid. It wasn't stupid, he said quietly. It was necessary. Around them, the cleanup continued with professional efficiency. Nina was being checked by a medic, Caleb was being loaded into an unmarked van, and the warehouse was being sanitized of evidence that could complicate the official story. What happens now? Alyssa asked. Seojun looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the woman who'd been kind to him in a restaurant, but someone who'd faced violence without breaking, who'd tried to warn him even when it put her at greater risk. Now you have a choice, he said. I can have you driven home. Your life goes back to normal. We pretend this never happened. And you're safe from anything like this ever touching you again. Or you let me take you to dinner, somewhere quiet, somewhere we can talk without interruption, and I tell you exactly who I am, what I do, and what it would mean if you decided to stay. The warehouse had fallen silent, except for the distant sound of sirens, police and ambulances that would arrive to find nothing more than an abandoned building and a few reports of suspicious activity that couldn't be substantiated. Alyssa looked at Seojun, at this man who'd saved her life and offered her truth in the same breath. The smart choice was obvious. Go home, forget this night. Return to a world where violence was something that happened to other people. But as she stood there, surrounded by the aftermath of chaos, she realized that safety wasn't the same as living. I'll take that dinner, she said quietly. But I want the whole truth, no matter how complicated it gets. Seojun's smile was small but genuine. It gets very complicated. I can handle complicated, even if it means your life will never be simple again. Alyssa thought of the restaurant where this had all started, of the loneliness that had made her vulnerable to Marco's abandonment, of the way Seojun had pulled out that chair and given her dignity when she'd needed it most. Simple is overrated, she said. Besides, someone once told me that you don't abandon people who need you. And do you need me? The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Alyssa looked at this man who'd turned her world upside down, who'd brought danger and protection in equal measure, who'd offered her truth when lies would have been easier. Yes, she said simply, I think I do. As they walked out of the warehouse together, Alyssa realized that some stories didn't end with rescue. They began with the choice to stay rescued, and she was ready to find out what came next. Years later, Alyssa would look back on that night in the warehouse as the moment her real life began. Not because of the danger or the drama, but because of what came after. The slow, careful building of something that neither of them had expected to find. Seojun kept his promise about honesty. Over dinners that stretched into the early hours of morning, he told her about Kim Industries, about the grey areas where legitimate business met necessary protection, about the choices he'd made to build something lasting in a world that respected only strength. Alyssa listened without judgment, asking questions that helped her understand not just what he did, but why he did it. She learned about the family he'd lost, the responsibilities he'd inherited, the careful balance between power and principle that defined his every decision. In return, she told him about her own dreams, the non-profit work she'd always wanted to pursue, the communities she wanted to serve, the difference she hoped to make in a world that often felt too large and indifferent. They discovered that protection could be partnership, that strength could be shared rather than hoarded. The transition wasn't seamless. There were moments when Alyssa questioned whether she could live with the weight of Seojun's world, and moments when he wondered if asking her to stay was the most selfish thing he'd ever done. But there were also mornings when she woke up in his arms and felt safer than she'd ever felt in her life. Evenings when he watched her work with at-risk youth and understood that some kinds of power came from giving rather than taking. Time had passed, and the woman who'd once sat alone in a restaurant had become someone who could hold her own in boardrooms and charity galas alike. She'd learned to navigate the complexities of Seojun's world while maintaining her own identity, her own values, her own dreams. "Do you ever regret it?" Seojun asked one evening as they sat on the balcony of their apartment. The city spread out below them like a constellation of possibilities. "Regret what?" "Letting me pull out that chair, staying for dinner with a stranger." Alyssa smiled, remembering the scared woman she'd been that night, abandoned and humiliated, and convinced she was destined to eat alone. "Never," she said, taking his hand in hers. "Best decision I never made." "You never made it. You made it for me. You saw someone who needed kindness and gave it without asking for anything in return." She squeezed his fingers gently. "That's when I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were worth the risk." Seojun lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "She sat alone after being stood up," he said quietly, "until the Korean Mafia boss pulled out the chair. And then she changed everything." In the distance, the city hummed with the endless energy of people building lives, making choices, taking chances on strangers who might become everything. Alyssa leaned against Seojun's shoulder, content in the knowledge that some stories didn't end with rescue. They began with the courage to stay rescued, to build something beautiful from the ashes of what came before. The chair he'd pulled out that night had been an invitation to more than just dinner. It had been an invitation to a life neither of them could have imagined alone, and they were still accepting it, one day at a time. Thank you for watching until the end. Korean Mafia Lovers has countless more passionate and thrilling stories waiting for you. Subscribe to our channel and help us continue creating these captivating tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat.